Institutions of government. The current structure of the government was put in place by the Constitution of 1993. It borrows from both presidential and parliamentary systems, and the resulting hybrid semi-presidential government is meant to allow for a strong presidency, but at the same time place some democratic checks on executive power. Its early history was stormy, but it's hard to say whether the difficulties centered on Yeltsin's ineffective presidency or if they reflected inherent flaws within the system. The relationships among the branches have stabilized, but in Putin and Medvedev's administrations, the executives have clearly dominated the other branches, and Putin has commanded the executive branch. The President and the Prime Minister. The executive branch separates the head of state, the President, from the head of government, the Prime Minister. Unlike the Queen's role in British politics, the President's position has been far from ceremonial. Although the Constitution provided for a strong presidency, under Putin, the President clearly came to dominate the Prime Minister. However, once Putin stepped aside to allow Dmitry Medvedev to run for and win the presidency, and Putin to become Prime Minister, the relationship between the two positions clearly changed, with Putin continuing to assert his influence. Since Putin's re-election in 2012, the President once again dominates the Prime Minister. Russian voters directly elect the President for a 6-year, starting in 2012, term, with a limit of 2 terms. Since Russian political parties are in flux, anyone who gets 1 million signatures can run for president. In 1996, 2000, and 2004, many candidates ran on the first ballot, and in 2000, 2004, and 2012, Putin won without a second-round vote. In 2008, Medvedev also won without a second-round vote. The president has the power to appoint the prime minister and cabinet. The Duma must approve the prime minister's appointment, but if they reject the president's nominee 3 times, the president may dissolve the Duma. In 1998, Yeltsin replaced Prime Minister Kiriyenko with Viktor Chernomyrdin, and the Duma rejected him twice. On the 3rd round, under the threat of being dissolved, they finally agreed on a compromise candidate, Yevgeny Primakov, Putin's prime minister when he ran for president, and when he became president, he appointed Mikhail Kasyanov as prime minister. Kasyanov served for 4 years and was eventually replaced by Mikhail Fradkov and then Viktor Zubkov. Putin then became prime minister in 2008, and in 2012, Medvedev switched places with Putin to become prime minister. Issue decrees that have the force of law. The president runs a cabinet that has a great deal of concentrated, centralized power. For example, Putin created the state-owned United Aircraft Corporation by decree, a decision that the legislature had no control over. According to the Constitution, the Duma has no real power to censure the cabinet, except that it may reject the appointment of the prime minister. Dissolve the Duma. This power was tested even before the Constitution was put in place. In 1993, Yeltsin ordered the old Russian parliament dissolved, but the conservative members staged a coup and refused to leave the White House, the parliament building. He ordered the army to fire on the building until the members gave up, but the chaos of the new regime was revealed to the world through the images of a president firing on his own parliament. No such chaos has occurred under Putin or Medvedev. There is no vice president, so if a president dies or resigns before his term is up, the prime minister becomes acting president. This situation occurred in 1999 when Prime Minister Putin took over presidential duties when Yeltsin resigned. Prime ministers are not appointed because they are leaders of the majority party, as they are in Great Britain. Instead, most have been career bureaucrats chosen for their technical expertise or loyalty to the president. However, during the 4 years when Medvedev was president and Putin took the prime minister's position, there was little doubt that Putin was still in charge. And so even though Medvedev was the head of state, policies did not change from those of Putin's presidency. A bicameral legislature. So far, the Russian legislature has proved to be only a very weak check on executive power. The lower house, the Duma, has 450 deputies who, since 2007, are all selected by proportional representation. The Duma passes bills, approves the budget, and confirms the president's political appointments. However, these powers are very limited since the president may rule by decree, and the Duma's attempts to reject prime ministers have failed. In another confrontation with Yeltsin, the Duma tried to use its constitutional power to impeach him, but the process is so cumbersome that it failed. Although the Duma has been controlled by Putin because of his party, United Russia, has most of the seats, it still wields some power in the drafting of legislation. Most legislation originates with the president or prime minister, just as it does in Great Britain, and most other parliamentary systems, but the Duma debates bills that must pass the deputies' vote before they become laws. The upper house, called the Federation Council, consists of 2 members from each of the 89 federal administrative units. Since 2002, 1 representative is selected by the governor of each region, and another by the regional legislature. The Federation Council serves a purpose that most upper houses do in a bicameral federalist systems, to represent regions, not the population as such. However, like most upper houses in European governments, it seems to mainly have the power to delay legislation. If the Federation Council rejects legislation, the Duma may override the council with a 2/3 vote. On paper, it also may change the boundaries among the republics, ratify the use of armed forces outside the country, and appoints and removes judges. However, these powers have not been used yet. The judiciary and the rule of law. No independent judiciary existed under the old Soviet Union, with courts and judges serving as pawns of the Communist Party. The Constitution of 1993 attempted to build a judicial system that is not controlled by the executive by creating a constitutional court. The court's 19 members are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Federation Council, and it is supposed to make sure that all laws and decrees are constitutional. Under Putin, the court has taken care to avoid crossing the president. However, even the possibility that it might have independent political influence led Putin to propose moving the seat of the court to St. Petersburg, away from the political center in Moscow. The Constitution also created a Supreme Court to serve as a final court of appeals in criminal and civil cases. The court, though, does not have the power to challenge the constitutionality of laws and other official actions of legislative and executive bodies. The Constitutional Court has that power. Both courts have been actively involved in policymaking, although their independence from the executive is questionable. One problem is that many prosecutors and attorneys were trained under the Soviet legal system, so the judiciary currently suffers from a lack of expertise in carrying out the responsibilities outlined in the Constitution. Vladimir Putin came into office with a mission to revive the great period of law reform under the Tsars, including jury trial, planned for all regions except Chechnya by 2007. Russia brought in procedural codes for criminal and civil rights and spent a great deal of money on law reform. However, the system is still very much in transition, and corruption is a serious problem. The advent of juries is a real change, but the presumption of innocence is far from a reality. The independence of the judiciary is still not apparent, especially since no courts have challenged Putin in his pursuit of the oligarchs and the dismantling of their empires. The trials of Mikhail Khodorkovsky and Platon Lebed, the former controlling shareholders of the Yukos oil company, indicate that the courts are still under the political control of Putin. Before the 2011 verdict was read that sentenced Khodorkovsky until 2019, Putin declared that the crime had been proven in court and that a thief must stay in jail. Hillary Clinton, the U.S. Secretary of State, protested. Attempts to exert pressure on the court are unacceptable, causing Russia's foreign ministry to challenge her statement. The Russian legal system has often been used as an instrument of the state's power, rather than as a tool for protecting citizens. In August 2013, 3 women from a feminist punk rock group, Pussy Riot, were sentenced to 2 years each in prison for an anti-Putin stunt in a Moscow cathedral. In 2013, the Duma passed new laws that raised fines for unsanctioned demonstration and required foreign-funded non-governmental organizations to register as foreign agents. Another law created a blacklist of offensive websites. Rule of law and corruption. Movement toward the rule of law continues to be blocked by corruption in state and society and by the political tradition of allowing the security police to continue to operate autonomously. In the Soviet period, the domestic security was carried out by the KGB, the State Security Committee, but since 1991, its functions have been split up among several agencies. The main domestic security agency is called the Federal Security Service, and no member or collaborator of the Soviet-era security service has been prosecuted for violating citizens' rights. Although the security police are generally regarded as one of the least corrupted of the state agencies, society-wide corruption is a major problem in Russia. One large-scale survey by a Moscow research firm found that at least half the population of Russia is involved in corruption in daily life. For example, people often pay bribes for automobile permits, school enrollment, proper health care, and favorable court rulings. This corruption not only impedes the development of rule of law, it also puts a drag on economic development since so much money is siphoned off in bribes. Putin initiated some high-profile battles against corruption in 2012, beginning with the dismissal of Anatoly Sodolyakov as defense minister. He was fired after investigators linked the company spun off from the ministry to fraud, and state-run television publicly revealed that other high-level bureaucrats had misappropriated funds. However, corruption is so embedded in the Russian political system that these efforts have not gotten to the root of the problem, and corruption remains a stubborn problem that is very difficult to eliminate. The military. The army was a very important source of Soviet strength during the Cold War era of 1945 to 1991. The Soviet government prioritized financing the military ahead of almost everything else. The armed forces at one time stood at about 4 million men, considerably larger than the United States combined forces. However, the military usually did not take the lead in politics, and generals did not challenge the power of the Politburo. Even though some of the leaders of the attempted coup of 1991 were military men, the armed forces themselves responded to Yeltsin's plea to remain loyal to the government. Under the Russian Federation, the army shows no real signs of becoming a political force. It has suffered military humiliation, and many sources confirm that soldiers go unpaid for months and have to provide much of their own food. Even as early as 1988, under Gorbachev, Soviet forces had to be withdrawn in disgrace from Afghanistan, and in 1994 to 1996, Chechen guerrillas beat the Soviet forces. More recently, the army partially restored its reputation by crushing Chechen resistance in 1999 to 2000. One prominent former military general, Alexander Lebed, gained a political following before the election of 1996, and Yeltsin had to court his favor in order to win re-election. However, most political leaders have been civilians, so a military coup appears to be unlikely in the near future. Even so, some observers were wary of a military takeover, especially considering the tentative nature of the democracy during the 1990s. Recently, Russia's army has reasserted its old vigor, with Putin's 2007 announcement that, for the first time in 15 years, the Russian Air Force would begin regular, long-range patrols by nuclear-capable bombers again. The move was seen by some observers as one of several signs that Russia is rising in strength and wishes to assert its influence internationally again. Military spending has increased significantly over the past few years, and the invasion of Georgia in 2008 was successful, with soldiers who appeared to be better trained than those who fought in earlier wars in Chechnya. However, the armed forces rely on factories with outdated technologies, and their production methods and recruitment of personnel remains low.